Montana Territory, 1882. A woman steps from a weathered stagecoach, clutching a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Her gloved hand shields her eyes from the harsh afternoon sun as she scans the rugged landscape, searching for the man whose promises of love and security had drawn her 2,000 miles from Philadelphia. But what awaits Rebecca Harlow isn't the welcoming arms of Thomas Blackwood or the thriving homestead his letters described in such vivid detail. Instead, she finds only charred remains and a solitary figure standing amid the ashes of what should have been her future. This is a story of betrayal and rebirth, of a woman who journeyed west seeking marriage, but found her true strength instead. It's about the unexpected bonds formed when life's carefully laid plans crumble to dust, and how two broken souls, one who can't speak and one who has lost her voice in society, discover that true connection requires no words at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty outpost of Willow Creek as the twice-monthly stagecoach from Helena lumbered to a stop. The wooden sign announcing Willow Creek Popato 143 hung crookedly from a single nail, the paint peeling away like the broken promises that seem to accumulate in these frontier towns. Rebecca Harlow smoothed the wrinkles from her navy traveling dress, once considered fashionable in Philadelphia drawing rooms, but now as out of place as she felt herself to be. At 26, with auburn hair pinned beneath a modest hat and hazel eyes that reflected both intelligence and wariness, Rebecca had made the journey that would forever divide her life into before and after. "Willow Creek," called the driver, a leathery man named Porter who had maintained a stoic silence for most of the final day's journey. "End of the line, miss." The knot in Rebecca's stomach tightened as she stepped down. The stagecoach had arrived precisely on schedule, September 21st, just as Thomas had specified in his last letter. She scanned the small gathering of curious onlookers, searching for a tall man with sandy hair and a scar above his right eyebrow, the description Thomas had provided of himself. "Mr. Thomas Blackwood?" she asked the driver, trying to keep her voice steady despite the dust coating her throat. "He was to meet me here today." Porter spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Blackwood? Can't say I know him. Might ask Sheriff Miller or check at Wilson's Mercantile. They'd know who's who around these parts." Rebecca's carefully maintained composure wavered. For 8 months, she had corresponded with Thomas Blackwood, whose letters described a prosperous cattle ranch 15 miles outside of Willow Creek. His most recent letter had explicitly stated he would meet her stagecoach on this exact date, with plans for them to be wed by the local preacher within the week. "I'll help with your trunks, ma'am," offered a freckle-faced boy of about 12, eyeing her luggage with entrepreneurial interest. "Thank you," Rebecca replied, grateful for the small kindness as the stagecoach rumbled away, leaving her standing, alone with her possessions, in a town that seemed considerably smaller than Thomas had described. "I need to locate Mr. Blackwood's ranch. Perhaps you know of it. Pinewood Ranch, about 15 miles north of here." The boy's face screwed up in confusion. "Pinewood? Don't know any ranch by that name. Only place north is Old Blackwood's Spread." But he hesitated, uncertainty crossing his young face. "But what?" Rebecca prompted, an uneasy feeling spreading through her chest. "Well, ma'am, there was trouble there, bad trouble, from what folks say." Before the boy could elaborate, a deep voice interrupted. "Tommy, that's enough gossip." A tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest approached. "Sheriff Miller, ma'am. Welcome to Willow Creek. You seem a bit lost." Rebecca squared her shoulders. "I'm Rebecca Harlow from Philadelphia. I've arranged to meet Thomas Blackwood here today. He owns Pinewood Ranch." Something flickered in Sheriff Miller's eyes. Recognition, followed by what Rebecca could only interpret as pity. "Miss Harlow, Perhaps we should talk in my office." The sheriff's office occupied a small but sturdy building at the far end of the town's single street. Inside, Sheriff Miller gestured for Rebecca to take a seat before lowering himself into a creaking chair behind a desk cluttered with wanted posters and official-looking papers. "Miss Harlow, I'm afraid I have difficult news," he began, removing his hat. "Thomas Blackwood passed away 6 weeks ago. His ranch was attacked by rustlers. They burned the main house to the ground." The words struck Rebecca like physical blows. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I received a letter from him just 3 weeks ago." Sheriff Miller's expression darkened. 3 weeks ago? I'm afraid that's not possible, Miss Harlow. Thomas Blackwood died in late July." With trembling fingers, Rebecca withdrew the bundle of letters from her satchel, untied the ribbon, and handed the most recent one to the sheriff. The sight of Thomas's familiar handwriting, the same careful hand that had penned all the previous correspondence, was both a comfort and now a bewildering mystery. The sheriff examined the letter, dated August 29th, his frown deepening as he read. "I'm sorry, Miss Harlow, but something isn't right here. Thomas Blackwood couldn't have written this letter. He was already gone when this was sent." "I don't understand," Rebecca said, struggling to make sense of the situation. "If Thomas didn't write these letters, then who did? And why?" Sheriff Miller sighed, returning the letter. "I can't say for certain. What I do know is that Thomas Blackwood's ranch was attacked by cattle rustlers in July. The main house was burned to the ground. Thomas didn't survive the attack. And Pinewood Ranch, the cattle operation he described, the home he was preparing for us?" Rebecca's voice caught on the last word. "The Blackwood spread was substantial once." Sheriff Miller replied, "One of the best cattle operations in the territory. As for the name, locals always called it the Blackwood Ranch, not Pinewood, though I recall there was a stand of pines near the house." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Miss Harlow, there is something else you should know. Thomas's younger brother Ethan survived the attack. He still lives on the property, in one of the outbuildings that wasn't destroyed. But he was changed by what happened that night." "Changed? How?" "Ethan Blackwood hasn't spoken a single word since they found him half dead beside his brother's body. The doctor says there's nothing physically wrong with him. The trauma just took his voice." Sheriff Miller leaned forward. "Miss Harlow, I hate to ask this, but did you send money to Thomas Blackwood?" Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Some. For wedding preparations, and to help furnish the house for my arrival." The sheriff nodded grimly. "I was afraid of that. You're not the first woman to be taken in by such schemes. Someone, not Thomas Blackwood, has been using his good name to convince Eastern women to send money west, often promising marriage and a comfortable life." "But the details in the letters," Rebecca protested, "about the ranch, about Willow Creek, they were so specific. Likely someone who knew Thomas or knew of his situation," Sheriff Miller replied. "I'm truly sorry, Miss Harlow. The Wilson House Inn has clean rooms at reasonable rates. You might want to rest there until the next eastbound stage on Thursday." Rebecca barely heard his suggestion, her mind racing with questions. If Thomas Blackwood was dead, who had been writing to her? Why continue the correspondence after his death? And what of Ethan Blackwood, the silent brother who had survived the attack? "The Blackwood Ranch," she said suddenly. "I'd like to see it." Sheriff Miller looked startled. "I'm not sure that's wise, Miss Harlow. It's a grim sight, and Ethan Blackwood isn't much for company these days." "Nevertheless," Rebecca said, her voice firmer than she felt, "I've traveled 2,000 miles based on letters apparently written by a dead man. I need to see this place for myself. Perhaps there are answers there that might make sense of all this." The sheriff studied her for a long moment. "I suppose that's your right. I can arrange for someone to take you out there tomorrow, though. I can't promise what kind of welcome you'll receive from Ethan Blackwood, if he acknowledges you at all." "Thank you," Rebecca said, rising to her feet. "I'll be ready at first light." As she stepped back into the harsh sunlight of Willow Creek's main street, Rebecca felt as if she were moving through a dream. The future she had envisioned, marriage, to Thomas Blackwood, a new life on a prosperous ranch, had vanished like morning mist. In its place stood uncertainty, deception, and a growing suspicion that the 8 months of correspondence that had given her such hope had been nothing but an elaborate lie. Yet beneath the shock and confusion, another emotion stirred: determination. She had left behind a life constrained by Philadelphia society's narrow expectations for unmarried women of a certain age. She had abandoned the hollow security offered by her cousin's grudging charity after her parents' deaths. Whatever answers awaited her at the burned remnants of the Blackwood Ranch, Rebecca knew one thing with certainty: she would not slink back to Philadelphia in defeat. The Mountain View Inn provided a small but clean room for $2 a night. As darkness fell over Willow Creek, Rebecca sat on the narrow bed, rereading Thomas Blackwood's letters by the light of a single oil lamp. Each page filled with descriptions of Montana's beauty, plans for their shared future, and what had seemed like genuine affection now took on a sinister quality. "My dear Rebecca," the final letter began, "as I write this, the summer sun is setting over the pine grove that gives our ranch its name. The new bedroom furniture you asked about has arrived from Helena, and your room faces east as you requested, to catch the morning light you so cherished in Philadelphia. I count the days until September 21st, when I will finally welcome you to the home we will build together." Rebecca folded the letter carefully, her fingers tracing the signature. "With deepest affection, Thomas," that now represented not a future husband, but a mystery that had drawn her across the continent. Tomorrow she would see for herself what remained of Thomas Blackwood's ranch, and perhaps meet the brother whose silence might hide the answers she sought. With that thought, Rebecca extinguished the lamp and lay back on the unfamiliar bed, wondering what dawn would reveal of the truth behind Thomas Blackwood's compelling lies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn broke over Willow Creek with streaks of amber and gold painting the distant mountains. Rebecca rose early, her few hours of sleep filled with troubling dreams of faceless men and burning buildings. After washing with cold water from the basin, she dressed in her most practical outfit, a sturdy brown skirt and white blouse with a woolen shawl to ward off the morning chill. In the inn's small dining room, she found a man waiting, not Sheriff Miller as she had expected, but a weathered older gentleman who introduced himself as Henry Mason. "Sheriff asked me to take you out to Blackwood's place," he explained, rising from his chair. "I run the livery stable. Known the Blackwood boys since they first came to the territory back in '75. Rebecca studied him over her coffee. "You knew Thomas Blackwood well, then?" A shadow crossed Mason's face. "Well as anyone, I suppose. Good man, hard-working, built that ranch up from nothing with his brother." He hesitated. "Miss, the sheriff told me your situation, about the letters and all. I gotta say, someone played you cruel. Thomas Blackwood wasn't the type to send for a mail-order bride." "What makes you say that?" Rebecca asked, her hands tightening around her cup. "Thomas was engaged to Catherine Summers, Judge Summers' daughter from over Helena way. Devastated her what happened, came for the funeral and everything. This revelation struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Not only was Thomas Blackwood dead, but he had been promised to another woman during the entire time she'd been corresponding with him." "I see," she said quietly. "And his brother, Ethan, what can you tell me about him?" Mason's expression softened slightly. "Younger by 4 years, different temperament, quieter, more bookish, good with horses though. Had a way with them. The two of them made a solid team." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. Terrible business, what happened to him. Found him half dead with a head wound. Clutching his brother's body, Dr. Henderson couldn't find anything physically wrong with his voice, said it was the shock of it all. And he still lives at the ranch, despite what happened there? Nowhere else to go, I reckon. He's rebuilding bit by bit, won't leave the land. It's all he has left of his family. The Blackwoods came from back east somewhere. Parents died years ago. The similarities to her own situation, orphaned and uprooted, stirred an unexpected feeling of kinship with this man she had never met. Rebecca finished her coffee and rose. "I'm ready whenever you are, Mr. Mason." The journey to the Blackwood. Wrench took nearly 2 hours by wagon, following a winding trail that cut through rolling grasslands and stands of pine. As they traveled, Mason pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation known locally as Eagle's Perch, a creek that ran strong even in late summer, and distant herds of cattle belonging to neighboring ranches. Blackwood land starts just beyond that rise, Mason said eventually, nodding toward a gentle slope ahead. About 300 acres all told. Good water, good grazing. Thomas had an eye for promising land. As they crested the hill, Rebecca caught her first glimpse of what should have been her future home. In a protected valley below stood the burned skeleton of what had once been a substantial house. The stone chimney remained intact, rising from the charred timbers like a monument to what had been lost. Nearby stood a barn, its roof partially collapsed on one side, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse or workshop some distance away. Near the workshop, a figure was visible, a man leading a horse toward a corral. Even from a distance, there was a careful deliberateness to his movements that suggested someone accustomed to working alone. "That's Ethan," Mason confirmed, following her gaze. "Looks like he's breaking that new colt I heard he purchased." As they approached, Rebecca felt her heart beating faster. What would she say to this man? How could she explain that she had come to marry his dead brother, a brother who apparently had been engaged to someone else? The whole situation seemed increasingly bizarre, a web of deception she couldn't begin to untangle. Mason drew the wagon to a halt, a respectful distance from the burned house. The man by the corral had stopped his work and was watching their approach, his stance wary but not threatening. "Ethan!" Mason called out with forced cheerfulness. "Brought someone to see you." Rebecca stepped down from the wagon without assistance, determined to present herself with dignity despite the awkwardness of the situation. As she approached, she got her first clear look at Ethan Blackwood. He was tall, though not as broad-shouldered as she had imagined his brother to be. His face, partially obscured by several days' growth of beard, bore the weathered look of someone who lived his life outdoors. Dark hair, in need of cutting, curled slightly at his collar, and his eyes, a striking shade of blue that contrasted sharply with his sun-darkened skin, studied her with undisguised wariness. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, stopping a respectful distance away. "My name is Rebecca Harlow. I've come from Philadelphia because—" She faltered, unsure how to explain her presence without sounding foolish. Ethan's expression remained impassive, though his eyes never left her face. "She's been receiving letters, Ethan," Mason explained, approaching to stand beside Rebecca. "Letters signed by Thomas. Recent ones. After he was gone." Something flickered in Ethan's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or concern, but he made no effort to speak or write a response. Rebecca took a deep breath. "Mr. Blackwood, I realize this must seem strange to you. It certainly does to me. For 8 months I corresponded with someone I believed to be your brother. I came here expecting to meet him, only to learn yesterday that he died weeks ago." She reached into her satchel and withdrew the bundle of letters. "These letters, particularly the later ones, described your ranch in detail. Whoever wrote them knew this place intimately." Ethan's gaze dropped to the letters in her hand, his expression impossible to read. "Sheriff Miller suggested someone has been using your brother's identity to mislead women like me, Rebecca continued. I need to understand what happened, not just for my own peace of mind, but because if someone is continuing this deception, other women might be victimized as well. For a long moment, Ethan simply stared at her. Then, abruptly, he turned and walked to the workshop, disappearing. Inside. He's not one for social niceties these days, Mason said apologetically. Maybe we should. Before he could finish, Ethan reappeared carrying a slate and chalk. He wrote quickly, the chalk scratching against the slate, then held it. Up for Rebecca to read. Never heard of you. Thomas engaged to Catherine. The blunt message confirmed what Mason had already told her, but seeing it written by Thomas's own brother made it undeniably real. Rebecca swallowed hard. Yes, Mr. Mason mentioned that, which makes these letters all the more confusing. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her since the sheriff's revelation. Mr. Blackwood, do you have any idea who might have written to me pretending to be your brother? Ethan erased the slate with his sleeve and wrote again. Many knew Thomas, can't say who would do this. Rebecca nodded, disappointment settling over her. She had hoped for clearer answers, but it seemed the mystery would not be so easily solved. Miss Harlow was hoping to see where the house stood, Mason said, into the awkward silence. She travelled a long way based on those letters. Ethan considered this, then nodded once and gestured for them to follow him. He led them to the burned remains of the main house, the ash and debris now settled after weeks of exposure to the elements. Standing before the stone steps that had once led to a front door, Rebecca felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The letters had described this place in such detail, the east-facing windows, the grove of pines that gave the ranch its name, the view of distant mountains from the front porch. It's just as the letters described it, she said softly. Ethan watched her closely, his expression thoughtful. Then he wrote on the slate again, "Where will you go now?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. In the shock of discovering Thomas's death, she hadn't thought beyond seeing the ranch for herself. I don't know, she admitted. The next eastbound stage leaves tomorrow, but she trailed off, unwilling to voice the complicated truth that returning to Philadelphia represented a kind of defeat she wasn't prepared to accept. She had sold most of her possessions to finance this journey, had left behind the suffocating charity of relatives who had made it clear that, at 26, she was a burden they bore out of obligation rather than affection. Ethan seemed to read something of her dilemma in her expression. He erased his slate and wrote a new message. "Town has boarding house. Might find work there." "Ethan's right," Mason said. "Mrs. Watkins runs a decent place, always looking for help with cooking and cleaning. And Willow Creek is growing. Stage comes through regular now. They're even talking about a proper school soon." Rebecca glanced around at the ruined homestead. Despite the destruction, she could see why Thomas, or whoever had written in his name, had been proud of this place. The setting was beautiful, the land rich with possibility. "What will happen to the ranch?" she asked Ethan. He wrote quickly, "Rebuilding, slowly." Alone? The question escaped before she could consider how personal it might sound. Ethan's expression hardened slightly as he wrote, "Have no choice." The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken emotion, determination, grief, perhaps even anger at the circumstances that had left him alone with such a monumental task. Rebecca recognized in his firm handwriting the same stubborn resolve that had brought her across the country on the strength of promising letters, only to find herself similarly alone and faced with rebuilding a future from unexpected ashes. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca found herself reluctant to go. The mystery of the letters remained unsolved, but somehow, standing amid the ruins of the Blackwood Ranch, she felt closer to understanding than she had in Sheriff Miller's office. "Thank you for allowing me to see this place," she told Ethan. "I'm sorry for your loss, and sorry that someone used your brother's name in such a deceptive way." Ethan studied her for a long moment, then wrote one final message. "Come again, if you need to." The unexpected invitation, simple as it was, offered Rebecca her first fragile thread of connection in this unfamiliar territory. As she climbed back into Mason's wagon, she realized that the journey that had begun with deception had led her to something unexpectedly genuine. A silent man's acknowledgement of shared loss and the tentative possibility of finding answers together. The next morning found Rebecca seated in Mrs. Watkins's dining room at the Willow Creek boarding house, staring at the stagecoach ticket in her hand. The eastbound stage would depart in 3 hours, and she had yet to decide whether to be on it. Mrs. Watkins, a robust woman in her 50s with iron-grey hair and shrewd eyes, refilled Rebecca's coffee cup without being asked. "Made your mind up yet, dear?" she inquired, her voice matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Not entirely," Rebecca admitted. She had spent a restless night weighing her options. Return to Philadelphia with her meager remaining funds and face the humiliation of admitting she had been duped, or stay in this raw frontier town where she knew no one and had no clear prospects. "Well, if you're of a mind to stay, I could use help around here," Mrs. Watkins said, settling her substantial frame into the chair opposite Rebecca. "Nothing permanent-like, but enough to keep you in room and board while you sort things out. Been running this place alone since Mr. Watkins passed 2 winters back, and these miners and cowhands don't clean up after themselves worth a lick." The offer, unexpected as it was, presented a viable third option that Rebecca hadn't seriously considered. "That's very kind of you," she said slowly, "but I wouldn't want charity." Mrs. Watkins snorted. "Charity? Girl, I'm talking about honest work for honest pay. 7 rooms need cleaning daily, meals need cooking, laundry needs washing. I'm not getting any younger and my arthritis acts up something fierce in the cold months." Before Rebecca could respond, the front door opened, admitting Sheriff Miller and a distinguished-looking gentleman in a tailored suit that seemed notably out of place in the frontier settlement. "Ah, Miss Harlow, good morning," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "This is Judge Summers from Helena. He's here on circuit court business, but he also wanted to meet you when I mentioned your unusual situation." Judge Summers extended his hand to Rebecca. His face, with its neatly trimmed silver beard and intelligent eyes, radiated authority tempered with kindness. "Miss Harlow, a pleasure. I understand you've been caught up in a troubling deception involving Thomas Blackwood." "Yes, sir," Rebecca replied, shaking his hand, "though I'm still trying to understand exactly what happened." "May I?" the judge asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. When she nodded, he seated himself with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to commanding a courtroom. "I had the privilege of knowing Thomas Blackwood rather well. My daughter Catherine was engaged to marry him this coming spring." Rebecca felt heat rising to her cheeks. "I'm very sorry for your daughter's loss, sir. I had no idea Thomas was promised to another when I began corresponding with whoever was writing to me in his name." "Of course you didn't," Judge Summers said firmly. "You're a victim in this matter, just as Thomas was a victim of the men who took his life." He paused, his expression growing more grave. "Miss Harlow, I hope you'll forgive my directness, but Sheriff Miller mentioned you received a letter, supposedly from Thomas, dated after his death. I'd be very interested in seeing this correspondence, if you're willing." Rebecca hesitated only, briefly before retrieving the bundle of letters from her satchel. "Here they are, sir, all of them, from the first in January to the last just 3 weeks ago." Judge Summers examined the letters carefully, his frown deepening as he read passages. "From several of them. This is most disturbing," he said finally. "The handwriting is remarkably similar to Thomas's, and the details about the ranch and this region are quite accurate." "Then you believe these were written by someone who knew Mr. Blackwood well?" Rebecca asked. "That would be my assessment." The judge agreed. "Someone with access to samples of his handwriting and intimate knowledge of his property and affairs." He tapped the letters thoughtfully. "Have you spoken with Ethan Blackwood about this matter?" "Briefly yesterday," Rebecca said. "He seemed as confused as I am about who might have sent these." Judge Summers nodded slowly. "Ethan's situation is complex. That he communicates at all is something of a miracle, given what he endured." The judge returned the letters to Rebecca. "Miss Harlow, I don't wish to alarm you, but there's a troubling aspect to this situation that concerns me. Whoever wrote these letters knew not only about Thomas's death, but felt confident enough to continue the deception afterwards, which suggests they might be connected to the attack itself," Sheriff Miller interjected grimly. Rebecca felt a chill run through her. "You think whoever killed Thomas Blackwood might be the same person who lured me here under false pretenses?" "It's a possibility we can't dismiss," Judge Summers said. "The rustlers who attacked the ranch were never apprehended. Most believe them to be a gang passing through the territory, but this business with the letters suggests someone with more permanent connections to the area." Mrs. Watkins, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "You think it might be someone from Willow Creek, one of our own?" The judge spread his hands. "I'm merely pointing out that whoever continued writing to Miss Harlow after Thomas's death had to know about his demise, had to have access to mail services, and had to be familiar enough with his affairs to maintain a convincing deception." Rebecca stared down at the letters, seeing them in a new and more sinister light. What had seemed merely cruel now appeared potentially dangerous. "What should I do?" "Return east on today's stage would be the safest course," Sheriff Miller suggested. Judge Summers, however, looked less certain. "Perhaps, though if our concerns have merit, whoever wrote these letters expected Miss Harlow to arrive in Willow Creek on yesterday's stage. They may be watching to see what she does next." The implication hung in the air. If someone had gone to such lengths to bring her here, they might not be pleased to see her leave before whatever plan they had set in motion could unfold. "I need to think," Rebecca said, feeling overwhelmed by these new considerations. "Of course," Judge Summers said, rising. "Sheriff Miller and I have court business to attend to this morning. Perhaps we could speak again this afternoon." After they departed, Rebecca sat in thoughtful silence, barely noticing when Mrs. Watkins cleared away the coffee cups. The mystery of Thomas Blackwood's letters had taken a darker turn than she could have imagined. If Judge Summers's suspicions were correct, she had been drawn into something far more complicated than a simple confidence scheme. Rising from the table, Rebecca made a sudden decision. "Mrs. Watkins, may I borrow paper and ink? There's something I need to do before deciding about the stage." With writing materials procured, Rebecca composed a brief note. "Mr. Blackwood, new information has come to light regarding the letters I showed you yesterday. Judge Summers believes they may be connected to the attack on your ranch. If convenient, I would value your thoughts on this matter. Respectfully, Rebecca Harlow." She sealed the note and asked directions to the livery stable where she found Henry Mason brushing down a mare. "Miss Harlow," he greeted her, surprise evident in his voice. "Thought you'd be preparing for the eastbound stage. My plans are in flux," she replied. "Mr. Mason, would it be possible for someone to deliver this note to Ethan Blackwood today?" Mason scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, my nephew Caleb rides out that way to check fences for the Patterson spread. Could probably drop it by." He studied her curiously. "Thought you'd seen all you needed of the Blackwood place." "There have been some developments," Rebecca said, unwilling to elaborate further. "I'd be grateful if your nephew could deliver this." "Consider it done," Mason promised, tucking the note into his shirt pocket. Though I can't guarantee Ethan will respond. Man keeps to himself more than ever these days." Rebecca thanked him and left, walking slowly through Willow Creek's dusty main street. The small frontier town was coming alive with morning activity, the mercantile opening its doors, a blacksmith's hammer ringing against his anvil, cowboys emerging bleary-eyed from the saloon where they'd apparently spent the night. It was as different from Philadelphia as could be imagined, yet Rebecca found herself studying the settlement with new eyes. Behind the rough exteriors of the buildings, she could see evidence of a community taking root. The small church with newly planted saplings in its yard, the schoolhouse under construction at the far end of town, women hanging laundry while children played in the dirt yards. Rebecca found herself walking toward the church, drawn by its simple white steeple, reaching toward the vast Montana sky. The door stood open, and she stepped inside, welcoming the cool dimness after the bright morning sun. "Good morning," a voice called from near the altar, where a man in a minister's collar was arranging hymnals. "Welcome to God's house. I'm Reverend Parker." "Rebecca Harlow," she introduced herself. "I arrived on yesterday's stage." "Ah, yes," the minister said, his expression shifting to one of sympathy. "Sheriff Miller mentioned your situation. A troubling business." "Very troubling," Rebecca agreed, settling into a pew. "Reverend, how well did you know Thomas Blackwood?" The minister joined her in the pew, his manner thoughtful. "Well enough to call him friend. He and Ethan weren't regular churchgoers, but Thomas helped build this structure 3 years ago, and he contributed generously to our community fund for widows and orphans." Reverend Parker sighed. His death was a terrible loss to Willow Creek, not just for what he was, but for what he might have become. He had vision, you see, believed this territory could be more than just a lawless frontier. "And his brother? Ethan?" "A more complicated soul," the minister said carefully. "Brilliant in his way, a voracious reader with a poet's sensibility, but always in Thomas's shadow, at least in terms of community standing. He preferred books and horses to people. Even before he trailed off, then added, his silence now seems almost an extension of the quietness that always defined him." Rebecca absorbed this description, trying to reconcile it with the wary, intense man she had briefly encountered. "Do you visit him?" "At the ranch? I've tried," Reverend Parker admitted. "He accepts my presence but offers little engagement. Grief takes strange forms, Miss Harlow. Some weep, some rage, some, like Ethan Blackwood, retreat into silence." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of running feet. A boy of about 14 burst into the church, his face flushed with exertion. "Miss Harlow," he called, looking around wildly. "Yes?" Rebecca stood, alarmed by his urgency. "I'm Caleb Mason. My uncle sent me to find you." The boy thrust a folded paper into her hands. "Mr. Blackwood gave me this to bring back. Said it was important you got it right away." With trembling fingers, Rebecca unfolded the paper to find a message written in a strong, decisive hand. "Do not take the stage. Someone watching. Come to the ranch after dark. Will explain." Rebecca stared at the cryptic warning, her heart pounding. Ethan Blackwood, who had barely acknowledged her yesterday, was now warning her of danger and offering explanations. What had changed? What did he know that he hadn't shared during their brief meeting? "Is everything all right, Miss Harlow?" Reverend Parker asked, concern evident in his voice. Rebecca carefully refolded the note. "I'm not entirely sure," she replied honestly, "but I believe I won't be taking the eastbound stage today after all." Dusk settled over Willow Creek, painting the distant mountains in purple shadow as Rebecca prepared for her clandestine journey to the Blackwood Ranch. After declining Mrs. Watkins' offer to have her nephew escort her, "You can't be riding out alone after dark, girl." She had arranged to borrow a horse from the livery stable under the pretense of an early morning ride the following day. "You're sure about this?" Henry Mason asked skeptically as he helped adjust the saddle on a gentle mare named Penny. "Nothing at that ranch that can't wait till morning. I appreciate your concern," Rebecca replied, checking the small saddlebag where she had packed a lantern, matches, and the bundle of letters. "But this is something I need to do." Mason sighed, resignation clear in his weathered face. "Trails, clear enough in moonlight. Follow the creek north, then cut east at the split oak. Can't miss it. Looks like lightning took half the tree years ago. From there, it's a straight shot to Blackwood land." He handed her the reins. "Penny knows the way if you get turned around. Used to belong to the Blackwoods before Thomas sold her to me last spring." The mention of Thomas sent a familiar pang through Rebecca, not of personal loss, but of the future that had been stolen from her through deception. "Thank you, Mr. Mason. I'll return her first thing tomorrow." "See that you do," he replied gruffly, though his eyes betrayed concern. "And Miss Harlow? If you're not back by noon, I'm sending the sheriff out after you." Rebecca nodded her understanding, touched by the protective instinct this community already showed toward her. A stranger who had arrived only 2 days prior. She mounted carefully, grateful for the riding lessons her father had insisted upon years ago in Philadelphia, though the western saddle felt different from what she was accustomed to. The ride through gathering darkness tested her nerves more than she had anticipated. Each rustling sound from the underbrush, each hoot of an owl or distant coyote's call, sent her heart racing. When the trail bent around a stand of aspens, the silver-trunked trees appeared ghostly in the moonlight, their leaves whispering secrets she couldn't decipher. The split oak appeared exactly as Mason had described it, a massive tree cleaved by ancient lightning, its 2 halves reaching toward the sky like supplicating hands. Rebecca guided Penny eastward, feeling the mare's confident stride beneath her. The horse did indeed seem to know the way, picking up her pace slightly as they crossed onto what must be Blackwood land. In the distance, the silhouette of the burned house became visible against the star-filled sky, the stone chimney standing like a sentinel among the ruins. No light was visible, but as Rebecca approached, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows of the nearby workshop. Ethan Blackwood, leading a lantern-lit path toward the barn. She dismounted somewhat stiffly, her muscles protesting the unaccustomed exertion of the ride. Ethan took Penny's reins without a word, his expression impossible to read in the dim light. He gestured for Rebecca to follow him into the barn, where a small area had been cleared amid the stalls and equipment. A lantern hung from a beam, illuminating a rough table and 2 chairs, apparently set up for their meeting. On the table lay Ethan's slate and chalk, alongside something Rebecca hadn't expected: a pot of coffee keeping warm on a small portable stove, and 2 tin cups. The domestic touch amid such unusual circumstances caught her off guard. Ethan stabled Penny efficiently, then took a seat at the table and reached for his slate. His writing was clear and direct. "Thank you for coming. Not safe to talk in town." "Your note was rather alarming," Rebecca said, settling into the chair opposite him and accepting the coffee he offered. "What did you mean about someone watching?" Ethan's jaw tightened as he wrote, "Saw stranger watching boarding house today. Same man was at Thomas's funeral. Not from around here." "You think he's connected to the letters? To what happened to your brother?" A sharp nod. "Too much coincidence." Ethan hesitated, then added, "Need to show you something." He rose and went to a locked chest in the corner of the barn. From it he withdrew several items: a ledger book, a stack of papers, and what appeared to be a bundle of letters. Returning to the table, he opened the ledger first and turned it, so Rebecca could see. The pages contained detailed records of cattle sales, supply purchases, and property improvements, written in a neat, orderly hand. Ethan flipped to the final entries, dated just days before Thomas's death, then pointed to a notation that read, "Paid J.W., 300, final payment." Rebecca studied the entry, confused. "I don't understand. Who is J.W.?" Ethan erased his slate and wrote quickly, James Whitley, foreman, quit 2 days before attack. This new information sent Rebecca's mind racing. You think this man Whitley was involved in the attack on the ranch? Ethan's expression darkened as he wrote, disappeared completely. No one has seen him since. Did you tell Sheriff Miller about your suspicions? Another sharp nod. No evidence, just timing. He hesitated, chalk hovering over the slate, then added, and this. From the bundle of papers, Ethan withdrew a folded letter and handed it to Rebecca. The paper was creased and worn, as if it had been read multiple times. The letter was addressed to Thomas Blackwood and dated 3 weeks before the attack. Blackwood, your final offer is noted but insufficient. Pinewood Ranch is worth twice that amount, given the water rights alone. Reconsider your position, or I'll be forced to explore less conventional avenues to settle our business. Some opportunities only present themselves once. J.W. Pinewood Ranch. Rebecca looked up, startled. That's what Thomas called the property in his letters to me. Not the Blackwood Ranch. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, suggesting this detail was new to him. He wrote rapidly, Thomas never called it that, always the ranch or Blackwood Place. Rebecca withdrew the letters from her saddlebag and spread them on the table. Yet in every letter to me, he referred to it as Pinewood Ranch. See here. She pointed to various passages in different letters. Spring has come to Pinewood Ranch. The new calf count at Pinewood is promising. When you arrive at Pinewood, I hope you'll find it as beautiful as I've described. Ethan stared at the letters, his expression troubled. After a moment he wrote, Whitley wanted to name it Pinewood if he bought it. Thomas refused to sell. So Whitley knew the name Pinewood Ranch, Rebecca said slowly. And that name appears in letters supposedly from Thomas, sent after his death. She met Ethan's intense gaze. This can't be coincidence. Ethan shook his head grimly, then wrote, Whitley was educated. Good handwriting. The pieces were beginning to align in a disturbing pattern. You think James Whitley wrote these letters, that he was involved in the attack that killed your brother, then continued writing to me, pretending to be Thomas? Ethan nodded, his expression pained as he wrote, Makes no sense otherwise. Rebecca sat back, trying to absorb the implications. But why? What purpose would be served by luring me here? Ethan frowned in concentration as he wrote his theory. Ranch still valuable. Thomas dead. I'm sole heir. If I died too, the property would go to auction, Rebecca finished, understanding dawning, and Whitley could potentially purchase it for less than he'd have to pay otherwise. A chill ran through her as another realization struck. Is that why you warned me about taking the stage? You think he meant to use my arrival somehow, perhaps as a distraction or... She couldn't complete the thought, but Ethan's grim expression confirmed her suspicions. He wrote, Worried you might be in danger too. Witness to letters. Connection. To his scheme. The barn suddenly seemed more isolated, the night darker beyond the lantern's glow. Rebecca took a steadying breath. We should take this information to Sheriff Miller immediately. Ethan shook his head and wrote, No proof Whitley wrote letters. Need more evidence. Then how do we get it? Rebecca asked, somewhat surprised too. Find herself thinking in terms of we rather than you when it came to solving this mystery. Ethan considered, then wrote deliberately, Check postmarks on letters. Where sent from? Track Whitley's movements. Rebecca nodded slowly, examining the envelopes. They were mailed from different locations. Helena, Bozeman, even one from Cheyenne. She traced the postmarks with her finger. If Whitley was traveling, after the attack, these could help establish his whereabouts. Ethan's eyes lit with approval as he wrote, Judge Summers could telegraph sheriffs in those towns. Ask about Whitley. The practical approach to unraveling the mystery gave Rebecca something to focus on beyond her own unsettled circumstances. "I'll speak with Judge Summers tomorrow before he leaves for Helena," she decided, "though I'm not sure how much I should reveal about our suspicions without more evidence." Ethan wrote quickly. "Tell him everything, trustworthy. Was like father to Thomas." He paused, then added with evident difficulty, "and me." This glimpse of personal connection was the most Ethan had revealed about himself since they'd met. Rebecca studied him across the table, this silent, grieving man who had lost not only his brother but also his voice to trauma, yet who was still fighting to find justice and answers. "Why did you decide to trust me?" she asked quietly. "Yesterday, you barely acknowledged me, but today you warn me of danger and share your suspicions." Ethan's expression softened slightly as he wrote, "Watched you yesterday. Saw real grief for Thomas, man you never met, not pretense." He hesitated, then added, "And I read the letters last night. Not Thomas's words, but good man wrote to you. Whitley played us both." The admission of his own vulnerability in being deceived seemed to cost Ethan something. His jaw tightening as he set the chalk down, Rebecca understood suddenly that her presence represented a painful reminder of his brother's absence, yet Ethan had overcome that personal discomfort to warn her of potential danger. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the warning and for trusting me with this." Ethan nodded once, then wrote, "Getting late. Not safe to ride back now." He gestured toward a corner of the barn where she now noticed a cot had been prepared with clean blankets. "You anticipated I might stay the night?" Rebecca asked, surprised by the thoughtfulness of the preparation. Ethan wrote, "Hoped you'd come. Safer here tonight. I'll keep watch." Under normal circumstances, the impropriety of such an arrangement would have been unthinkable. But Rebecca was beginning to understand that frontier life operated by different rules. Practicality and survival often trumped social conventions. "Where will you sleep?" she asked. Ethan pointed toward the workshop visible through the open barn. "A door. That's where you've been living since the attack? Not in the bunkhouse," he wrote briefly. "Bunkhouse has too many ghosts." The simple statement conveyed volumes about the depth of his loss and the painful memories that haunted the property. Rebecca realized that Ethan wasn't just dealing with his brother's death, but with the violent transformation of his home into a crime scene. "I understand," she said softly, "and I appreciate your concern for my safety." After ensuring she was settled, Ethan left her with a spare lantern and returned to his workshop. Through the window, Rebecca could see him moving about inside, checking a rifle before placing it near the door. Alone in the barn, surrounded by the quiet sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the occasional distant call of nightbirds, Rebecca contemplated the extraordinary turn her journey had taken. She had traveled west, expecting to marry Thomas Blackwood and begin a new life on his ranch. Instead, she found herself allied with his silent brother, tracking a killer who might now have Rebecca herself in his sights. As she extinguished the lantern and settled onto the cot, Rebecca was struck by an unexpected realization. Despite the danger and uncertainty, she felt more purposeful, more alive, than she had in years of genteel poverty in Philadelphia. Here, in this raw territory, facing dangers she couldn't have imagined days ago, she had found something she hadn't known she was seeking, a genuine reason to stay. Dawn broke over the Blackwood Ranch with fingers of golden light stretching across the valley. Rebecca awoke to the soft sounds of morning, horses nickering in their stalls, birds announcing the new day, and the creak of a pump handle as water splashed into a bucket outside the barn. She emerged from her makeshift sleeping quarters to find Ethan already at work, his sleeves rolled up as he filled a wash basin. When he noticed her, he gestured toward the basin with a questioning look. "Thank you," Rebecca said, grateful for the chance to refresh herself after the night in the barn. The water was cold but reviving, and she did her best to make herself presentable, conscious of Ethan's courteous distance as he busied himself with the horses. When she had finished, he appeared with his slate, coffee and breakfast in workshop. The workshop, a sturdy structure that had survived the attack unscathed, had been transformed into a Spartan but functional living space. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner, a narrow cot another. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes, ranging from practical manuals on animal husbandry to leather-bound collections of poetry and philosophy that seemed surprisingly refined for a frontier ranch. Rebecca noticed a small photograph in a silver frame on a shelf, two men standing before the main house that now lay in ruins. The resemblance between them was clear, the same strong jaw and straight nose, though the taller man, presumably Thomas, had a broader build and a more commanding presence. Ethan appeared leaner, more self-contained even then, his expression thoughtful rather than confident. A simple breakfast awaited on the workbench that doubled as a table, coffee, biscuits, and preserves. Ethan wrote, "Not much, but filling." "It's perfect," Rebecca assured him, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. They ate in companionable silence, the routine domesticity of the meal creating a momentary reprieve from the danger and mystery that had brought them together. "You have quite a library," Rebecca observed, gesturing toward the bookshelves. "I wouldn't have expected to find Emerson and Thoreau in a Montana workshop." Ethan's expression lightened slightly as he wrote, "Books travel well, brought favorites. From Boston." "You're from Boston originally?" Rebecca asked, surprised by this connection to her own familiar territory. He nodded, writing, "Until 75. Father was professor at Harvard. Mother from Virginia. Both died in 74, influenza." This glimpse into Ethan's past, his educated background, the loss of his parents, explained much about the refined elements Rebecca had observed amid the frontier roughness. "I'm from Philadelphia myself," she offered. "My parents passed 2 years ago, leaving me in the care of relatives who made it clear I had overstayed my welcome." Ethan's penetrating gaze seemed to understand all she wasn't saying about her circumstances, the precarious position of an unmarried woman of a certain age without financial resources. He wrote simply, "Why Thomas's letters appealed to you." "Yes," Rebecca acknowledged. "The prospect of marriage to a respectable rancher seemed preferable to becoming an unpaid companion to my aunt in her declining years." She sighed. "Though it appears I exchanged one uncertain future for another." Ethan studied her thoughtfully, then wrote, "What will you do now?" It was the question Rebecca had been asking herself since arriving in Willow Creek. "For the immediate future, Mrs. Watkins has offered me work at her boarding house. It would provide room and board while I—" She trailed off, unsure how to complete the thought. Ethan waited, his expression open but unreadable. "While I decide whether to stay in Montana Territory," Rebecca finished. "Though after what you've shared about James Whitley and his possible connection to the letters, I'm not sure I should remain in Willow Creek at all. If he intended some harm by luring me here." Ethan's writing was swift and decisive. Leaving might be safest, but would mean he wins again. The simple statement stirred something in Rebecca, a determination not to be victimized further, not to allow whoever had deceived her to dictate her next steps as well. "You're right," she said slowly, "and there's something unfinished here, not just the mystery of the letters, but—" She gestured toward the ruins of the main house visible through the workshop window. "All of this. What happened to your brother? What's still happening?" Ethan nodded, his expression grave as he wrote, "Need to speak with Judge Summers today, before he returns to Helena." "Yes," Rebecca agreed, returning to the practical matter at hand. "I should ride back to town immediately." They set out shortly thereafter, Rebecca on Penny and Ethan on his own mount, a powerful black gelding. The morning was clear and cool, the landscape transformed by daylight into a panorama of rolling grasslands and distant mountains that took Rebecca's breath away despite the circumstances. "It's beautiful," she remarked as they rode. "I can understand why your brother was so proud of this land." Ethan nodded, his expression softening as he surveyed the territory that was now solely his responsibility. The pride was evident in his bearing, though tinged with the weight of all that had been lost. They reached Willow Creek to find the small town already buzzing with activity. Their arrival together drew curious glances. Ethan Blackwood was apparently a rare sight in town these days, and his appearance with the newcomer from Philadelphia generated immediate interest. At the courthouse, they found Judge Summers preparing for the day's proceedings. His eyebrows rose in surprise when his clerk announced their visit, but he welcomed them into his temporary chambers with courteous concern. "Miss Harlow, Mr. Blackwood," he greeted them, his keen gaze taking in their travel-worn appearance. "I confess I'm surprised to see you together. Has something occurred?" Rebecca glanced at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she explained everything. The warning about being watched, their late-night meeting at the ranch, and most importantly, their discovery about James Whitley and the Pinewood Ranch connection. Judge Summers listened intently, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When Rebecca finished, he turned to Ethan. "You believe Whitley orchestrated the attack that killed your brother? That seems an extraordinary step, even for a man desperate to acquire property." Ethan wrote on his slate, his movements deliberate, not just about property. "Thomas knew something. About Whitley. Something dangerous." "What do you mean?" the judge asked, leaning forward. Ethan hesitated, then wrote, "Week before attack, Thomas received letter from bank in Helena. Wanted to discuss Whitley's references. Thomas suspicious about Whitley's past." "And you believe Whitley discovered this inquiry?" Judge Summers asked. Ethan nodded grimly. "This puts things in a different light," the judge said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "If Whitley feared exposure of some prior wrongdoing, he might indeed have taken desperate measures." He turned to Rebecca. "And his continued correspondence with you, Miss Harlow, suggests a plan still in motion." "But what purpose would my arrival serve?" Rebecca asked. "If his goal was to eliminate Ethan and acquire the ranch at auction, how would I factor into that plan?" The judge considered this. Perhaps as a distraction, or even as a scapegoat if another tragedy were to occur. He shook his head. "These are serious allegations against a man who has disappeared. We need more than suspicious timing and a connection to the name Pinewood before we can act officially." "The postmarks," Rebecca suggested, showing him the envelopes. "If Whitley was in these towns on these dates, it would strengthen the connection." "Indeed it would," Judge Summers agreed. "I'll telegraph the authorities in each location immediately, inquiring about Whitley's whereabouts during those periods." He turned to Ethan. "In the meantime, I strongly suggest you exercise extreme caution, Mr. Blackwood. If your suspicions about Whitley are correct, you remain his primary obstacle to acquiring your family's property." Ethan's jaw tightened as he wrote, "Been living with that knowledge since Thomas died." The judge's expression softened with sympathy. "Of course you have. And you, Miss Harlow, I'm concerned about your safety as well. If Whitley realizes you've made these connections—" "I've accepted Mrs. Watkins' offer of employment at her boarding house," Rebecca said. "She seems quite formidable. I doubt anyone would attempt mischief under her watchful eye." Judge Summers smiled slightly. "Edith Watkins is indeed a force to be reckoned with. Still, I would advise both of you to share your suspicions with Sheriff Miller. The more eyes watching for Whitley, the better." As they left the courthouse, Rebecca noticed Ethan scanning the street with heightened vigilance, his posture tense and alert. She realized with a sudden chill that he had been living this way for weeks, constantly watchful, perpetually braced for danger, isolated not just by his trauma-induced silence, but by the very real threat of a killer who remained. "At large, will you return to the ranch now?" she asked as they reached the livery stable where Mason was waiting to reclaim Penny. Ethan nodded, then hesitated before writing. Supply wagon comes tomorrow. Need lumber, tools for repairs. Rebecca understood the unspoken message. He would be in town again soon, would check on her, ensure her safety. The protective impulse touched her unexpectedly. "I'll be fine at Mrs. Watkins' boarding house," she assured him. "But please be careful yourself. You're alone out there." His expression shifted, something like grim humor flickering in his eyes as he wrote, "Been alone since Thomas died. Used to it." The simple statement carried layers of meaning, not just physical isolation, but the profound solitude of being the sole keeper of his suspicions, the only witness to his brother's final moments, a man cut off from normal communication by trauma and circumstance. "Well, you're not completely alone anymore," Rebecca said firmly. "At least in this matter with Whitley, we're allies now." Ethan studied her face, seeming to assess the sincerity of her words. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, for he nodded once, a gesture that conveyed both acknowledgement and a certain solemn gratitude. As he mounted his horse to leave, Sheriff Miller approached, his expression concerned. "Miss Harlow, Mr. Blackwood, Judge Summers just informed me of your suspicions regarding James Whitley. I wish you'd come to me directly," Ethan wrote quickly. "No proof yet, just theories." "Even so," the sheriff said, "theories based on the evidence you've gathered warrant investigation." He turned to Rebecca. "I understand you'll be staying at Mrs. Watkins' place. That's good. Safest spot in town with that woman standing guard. But I'll keep an extra eye on the boarding house just the same." To Ethan, he added, "And I'll ride out to check on you every couple of days, Blackwood. No arguments. That place is too isolated for a man in your situation." Ethan's expression suggested he might dispute this assessment of his vulnerability, but after a moment, he simply nodded in acceptance. As Rebecca watched him ride away, the straight-backed figure gradually diminishing with distance, she was struck by the strange turn of events that had brought her into the orbit of this silent, wounded man. She had come to Montana Territory expecting to meet Thomas Blackwood, a man who existed now only in falsified letters and the memories of those who had known him. Instead, she found herself allied with his brother in a dangerous pursuit of truth and justice, a pursuit that might determine not just who had killed Thomas Blackwood, but whether Rebecca herself had a future in this rugged territory. With a deep breath, she turned toward the boarding house, ready to begin whatever unexpected chapter awaited her in Willow Creek. The first week at Mrs. Watkins' boarding house passed in a flurry of activity as Rebecca settled into her new role. The work was demanding. Rooms to clean, meals to prepare, laundry to wash and iron. But there was satisfaction in the simple physical tasks that left little time for brooding on uncertainties. Mrs. Watkins proved to be a fair employer and a font of local knowledge, sharing the history and secrets of Willow Creek's residents as they worked side by side in the kitchen. "The Miller brothers own most of the businesses on the north side of town," she explained, while kneading bread dough with strong, capable hands. "Started with one dry goods store 10 years ago and expanded every time someone couldn't make their payments. Not bad men, exactly, but they understand power and aren't shy about using it." Rebecca listened attentively, recognizing that in a frontier town like Willow Creek, understanding the local dynamics might prove as important as the official investigation into James Whitley's whereabouts. "And what about the Blackwoods?" she asked carefully. "How were they regarded in town?" Mrs. Watkins's expression softened. "Thomas was respected, fair in business, generous with those in need, built that ranch from nearly nothing after their parents passed, carried himself like a natural leader." She paused, flour dusting her forearms. Ethan was different, brilliant mind, according to Reverend Parker, who loaned him books, but he kept to himself, let Thomas handle the public side of things. And after Thomas's death, how do people view Ethan now? The older woman sighed. "Some feel sorry for him, that silence and all. Others find it unsettling, think he should have fought harder, maybe prevented what happened. She shook her head disapprovingly. Easy to judge when you weren't there, I say. Trauma affects everyone differently. Rebecca absorbed this assessment, understanding better why Ethan kept his distance from town. Has he always been so isolated, or is that recent? Oh, he was never one for socializing, but he'd come to town regular before. Supplies, mail, occasional dinner at the hotel. Since Thomas died, it's bare necessity only. Mrs. Watkins gave Rebecca a shrewd look, though I notice he's been in town twice this week already. Curious timing, that. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks. We're working together on a matter related to his brother's death, she said carefully. Mrs. Watkins replied, a knowing glint in her eye. Well, whatever the matter is, it's the first time I've seen that boy showing interest in anything beyond bare survival since the tragedy. Can't help but think that's a good sign. Before Rebecca could respond to this observation, the front door opened, admitting Sheriff Miller. His expression was grave as he approached them in the kitchen. Miss Harlow, might I have a word, in private, if possible? Mrs. Watkins wiped her hands on her apron. Use the parlor. Nobody in there this time of day. Once they were seated in the modestly furnished room, Miller removed his hat, turning it absently in his hands. I've received some information from Judge Summers I thought you should know immediately. He telegraphed from Helena this morning. Rebecca's pulse quickened. About James Whitley, the sheriff nodded. Authorities in Bozeman confirmed a man matching Whitley's description was there exactly when that letter to you was postmarked. He stayed at the Western Hotel under the name James Warren. Warren, Rebecca repeated. His real name, perhaps? That's what the judge suspects. He's having inquiries made in Missouri, where Whitley claimed to be from originally. But there's more. Miller leaned forward, his voice lowering. The telegram mentioned that this man Warren was asking questions about stagecoach schedules to Willow Creek, specifically inquiring about passengers arriving from the east. A chill ran through Rebecca. He was monitoring when I would arrive. Seems that way, Miller agreed grimly, which confirms your suspicion that you were deliberately lured here as part of some larger scheme. Rebecca tried to process this information, the confirmation that she had been manipulated by a man who may have murdered Thomas Blackwood. Does Ethan know yet? I sent word to the ranch this morning. Expected he might come to town when he heard, but there's been no sign of him. Something about the sheriff's tone triggered a flutter of alarm in Rebecca's chest. Is that unusual? Miller hesitated. Blackwood typically responds to messages promptly, even if just with a written note, and with the supply wagon scheduled. For today, he stood abruptly. I think I'll ride out there, make sure everything's all right. I'll come with you, Rebecca said, rising to her feet. The sheriff shook his head. Miss Harlow, if there is trouble at the ranch, the last place you should be is— Sheriff Miller, Rebecca interrupted firmly. I've been entangled in this situation since before I arrived in Willow Creek. If Ethan is in danger, it's partly because of information I helped uncover. I'm coming with you. Miller studied her determined expression, then sighed in resignation. Mrs. Watkins won't like it. I'll handle Mrs. Watkins, Rebecca assured him. How soon can we leave? 30 minutes later, they were riding out of Willow Creek, Rebecca on, a borrowed mare and Sheriff Miller on his sturdy bay. The sheriff maintained a watchful silence as they traveled, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon and surrounding terrain. You're concerned about more than just Ethan not responding to your message, Rebecca observed as they neared Blackwood Land. Miller nodded grimly. Judge Summers' telegram included something else. Warren, or Whitley, was seen purchasing significant quantities of kerosene in Bozeman, the kind that could accelerate a fire. Rebecca's blood ran cold at the implication. You think he might have returned to finish what he started at the ranch? It's a possibility we can't ignore, the sheriff replied. especially with this confirmation that he's been tracking your movements. If he believes you and Ethan have connected the dots about his involvement, he didn't need to finish the thought. Rebecca urged her horse to a faster pace, anxiety building with each passing mile. As they crested the final rise overlooking the Blackwood Ranch, Rebecca's heart sank. Smoke rose from the direction of the workshop, not the thin, controlled plume of a cooking fire or stove, but thick black billows, suggesting something far more ominous. "Dear God," Miller muttered, spurring his horse forward. "Stay behind me, Miss Harlow." But Rebecca was already racing down the slope, fear propelling her forward with reckless speed. As they drew closer, the scene became clearer. The workshop was engulfed in flames, fire licking up the wooden walls and pouring from the windows. Of Ethan there was no sign. Sheriff Miller dismounted swiftly, drawing his pistol. "Blackwood!" he shouted, circling toward the burning building. "Ethan Blackwood!" Rebecca's eyes darted frantically around the property, searching for any indication of Ethan's whereabouts. Had he been inside when the fire started? Was he somewhere nearby, injured or worse? The thought sent a surge of unexpected emotion through her, not just concern for a man in danger, but a deeper, more personal distress at the possibility of losing someone who had begun to matter to her. A movement near the barn caught her attention, a flash of color against the weathered wood. Without waiting for the sheriff, Rebecca ran toward it, her heart pounding with fear and hope. She found Ethan behind the barn, crumpled against the wall, a bloody gash across his forehead and his right arm hanging at an awkward angle. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. "Sheriff, here!" she called, dropping to her knees beside the injured man. "Ethan, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered at her voice, then opened to reveal pain-clouded blue eyes that struggled to focus on her face. Sheriff Miller arrived at a run, cursing under his breath at the sight of Ethan's injuries. "Blackwood, what happened? Who did this?" Ethan's gaze shifted to the sheriff, recognition dawning slowly. With his left hand, he made a weak gesture, mimicking writing. Rebecca looked around desperately. "He needs his slate, something to write with." Miller pulled a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. "Here, use this." With trembling fingers, Ethan managed to scrawl a single word. "Whitley." "He was here?" "James Whitley?" Miller asked urgently. Ethan nodded weakly, wincing at the movement. He wrote again, the letters shaky but legible. "Ambush Workshop." "We need to get him to town," Rebecca said, noticing how pale Ethan had become. "He needs Dr. Henderson." Miller nodded grimly. "Can you ride, Blackwood, or should we rig something to carry you?" Ethan struggled to sit up straighter, his determination evident despite his injuries. He wrote, "Can ride, Whitley, heading north." "Don't worry about Whitley now," the sheriff said firmly. "Let's get you to safety first. I'll organize a posse once you're with the doctor." As they helped Ethan to his feet, Rebecca noticed him looking back at the burning workshop with an expression of profound loss. Following his gaze, she realized what the fire represented beyond the immediate danger. Ethan's books, his few personal possessions, the space he had made into a home after the main house was destroyed. Once again, James Whitley had taken not just physical security, but the small comforts that made life bearable. The ride back to Willow Creek was slow and tense, with frequent stops when Ethan seemed close to falling from his saddle. Rebecca stayed beside him, ready to provide support if needed, while Sheriff Miller led the way, his vigilant gaze constantly sweeping their surroundings for any sign of Whitley. The town erupted in activity at their arrival, with curious onlookers gathering as Sheriff Miller called for Dr. Henderson. Mrs. Watkins emerged from the boarding house, her usual composure giving way to genuine alarm at the sight of Ethan's condition. "Bring him inside immediately," she ordered, taking charge of the situation with practiced efficiency. "I've got a ground floor room ready. Dr. Henderson's already on his way. saw the commotion from his office window. As they settled Ethan in the boarding house's best room, Rebecca found herself reluctant to leave his side, even when the doctor arrived to tend his injuries. There was something in Ethan's expression when he looked at her, of vulnerability beneath the stoic acceptance, of pain that touched her deeply. "I'll be just outside," she assured him, when Mrs. Watkins gently suggested she give the doctor space to work. In the hallway, she found Sheriff Miller speaking intently with two men she recognized as local ranchers. "Heading north, according to Blackwood," the sheriff was saying. "Probably making for the territorial border. We'll need fresh horses and supplies for at least 3 days of pursuit." "You're forming a posse," Rebecca said, approaching the group. Miller nodded grimly. "This has gone beyond property disputes or suspicious circumstances. Whitley or Warren, whatever his real name is, just attempted murder in my jurisdiction. I aim to bring him in to face justice for that and for Thomas Blackwood's death." "When do you leave?" "Within the hour," Miller replied. "Soon as my deputies gather the necessary supplies, and I've spoken with Ethan about exactly what happened." Dr. Henderson emerged from the room then, wiping his hands on a cloth. "He'll recover," the doctor announced without preamble. "Concussion, broken arm, assorted cuts and bruises. Nothing life-threatening, though that head wound was a near thing. An inch to the left and we'd be planning a funeral instead of a recovery." A collective sense of relief passed through the group. The doctor continued, "He's asking for Miss Harlow. Seems rather insistent about it in his way." Rebecca entered the room to find Ethan propped up against pillows, his arms splintered and bandaged, a clean white dressing around his head. Despite these signs of injury, his eyes were clearer now, focused intently on her as she approached. "The doctor says you'll recover fully," she said, taking a seat beside the bed. "Thank goodness Sheriff Miller insisted on checking on you when you didn't respond to his message." Ethan reached for the notebook Miller had left, writing awkwardly with his left hand. "You came too. Dangerous." "Of course I came," Rebecca replied, simply. "We're allies in this, remember?" Something softened in his expression as he wrote again. "Thank you." "Ethan," she said quietly, "Sheriff Miller is forming a posse to pursue Whitley. He needs to know exactly what happened at the ranch." Ethan nodded carefully, then began to write, his left-handed script laborious but determined. "Whitley came at dawn. Claimed to be lost traveler. Recognized him too late. Hit me when my back turned. Said would finish what started with Thomas. You were next. Fire to destroy evidence." Rebecca's breath caught at the explicit confirmation that she had indeed been the next target. "How did you escape the workshop?" "Woke up inside. Smoke. Managed to break window. Crawled out before flames spread." The simple account belied what must have been a terrifying ordeal. Regaining consciousness in a burning building, injured and disoriented, yet finding the strength to escape before the flames consumed everything. "You're safe now," she assured him, impulsively placing her hand over his. "Mrs. Watkins runs this boarding house like a fortress, and Sheriff Miller will find Whitley." Ethan turned his hand to clasp hers briefly, the gesture conveying what his silence and injured state prevented him from expressing otherwise. Then he wrote one more message, his expression troubled. "If Miller fails, Whitley will return. For both of us." The words hung between them, a stark reminder that their ordeal was far from over. As long as James Whitley remained at large, both Ethan and Rebecca remained targets of a man who had already proven his willingness to kill. 3 days passed with no word from Sheriff Miller's posse. Willow Creek settled into an uneasy vigilance, with men taking turns, standing watch at night, and women traveling in groups during daylight hours. The attack on Ethan Blackwood had transformed a distant threat into an immediate concern that touched everyone in the small community. At Mrs. Watkins' boarding house, Rebecca divided her time between her regular duties and tending to Ethan, who chafed against confinement, despite Dr. Henderson's strict orders to rest. His left-handed writing had improved with practice, allowing for more fluid communication than in those first difficult hours after the attack. "Any news?" he wrote, looking up as Rebecca entered his room with a breakfast tray on the fourth morning. She shook her head. "Nothing yet. But Mr. Patterson rode in from his ranch last night and said they found tracks heading toward the mountains. A single rider moving fast." Ethan's expression darkened as he wrote, "Knows that country well. Helped Thomas map northern grazing land last spring." "Sheriff Miller knows those mountains too," Rebecca reminded him, arranging his breakfast within easy reach. "And he has 5 experienced men with him." Ethan didn't appear convinced, but he began eating, his movements awkward with his dominant arm immobilized. Rebecca had grown accustomed to these quiet moments together, the initial self-consciousness about their unusual situation giving way to a comfortable routine that required no pretense or explanation. "Dr. Henderson says you can try walking a bit today," she said, straightening the already neat room. "Just in the hallway at first, but it's progress." Ethan wrote quickly, "Need to return to ranch soon. Animals need care." "Henry Mason sent his son out to check on your horses yesterday," Rebecca assured him. "And the Pattersons have been keeping an eye on your cattle. Everyone understands you can't manage alone right now." A flash of frustration crossed Ethan's face as he wrote, "Not used to depending on others." "Nor am I," Rebecca admitted. "Yet here we both are, learning that sometimes independence must give way to necessity." She smiled slightly. "Mrs. Watkins, it tells me it's the frontier way. Neighbors helping neighbors through hard times." Something in her words seemed to resonate with Ethan, easing the tension in his shoulders. He wrote thoughtfully, "Thomas believed in community, said isolation was the true enemy out here, not weather or distance." "Your brother sounds like he was a wise man," Rebecca said gently. Ethan nodded, a shadow of grief crossing his features. Then he wrote, "Would have liked you, your determination." The simple assessment touched Rebecca deeply, not just for the compliment itself, but for what it revealed about Ethan's acceptance of her presence in his life. Despite the terrible circumstances that had brought them together, a genuine connection had formed, built on shared danger and mutual respect. The moment was interrupted by commotion from the street, shouts and the sound of horses approaching at speed. Rebecca moved swiftly to the window, pulling back the curtain to see riders entering town from the north. "It's Sheriff Miller," she announced, recognizing his distinctive silhouette even at a distance. "They've returned." Ethan struggled to rise, grimacing as the movement jarred his injured arm. "Stay put," Rebecca ordered firmly. "I'll find out what news they bring." She hurried outside, joining the growing crowd that had gathered around the returning posse. Sheriff Miller looked exhausted, his face weathered by days of hard riding and exposure to the elements. The men with him appeared similarly worn, their expressions grim rather than triumphant. "Did you find him?" called someone from the crowd. Miller dismounted stiffly. "Tracked him to Bitterroot Pass, lost the trail in the rockfall area where that flash flood hit last spring." His voice carried clear disappointment. "We pushed as far as we could, but with supplies running low and weather turning, had to make the call to return." Murmurs of dissatisfaction rippled through the gathering, though no one directly challenged the sheriff's decision. Montana's mountain terrain was notoriously unforgiving, and an early autumn storm could turn deadly for unprepared riders. "What now?" asked Mrs. Watkins, who had joined Rebecca outside. "I've sent telegrams to every settlement within 100 miles, Miller replied. "Description of Whitley, warning about his dangerous nature. If he shows his face anywhere in the territory, we'll hear about it." He scanned the crowd. "How's Blackwood doing?" "Recovering," Rebecca answered, though frustrated by the confinement. "Tell him I'll stop by later today after I've had some sleep," the sheriff said, the exhaustion evident in his voice. "There are details about Whitley's attack I still need to document officially." As the crowd dispersed and the sheriff's men led their tired horses toward the livery stable, Rebecca returned to the boarding house, trying to formulate how best to deliver the disappointing news to Ethan. He would take Whitley's escape hard, she knew. Yet another injustice piled atop all he had already endured. She found him sitting on the edge of the bed, clearly having ignored her instruction to remain still. His expression told her he had already deduced the outcome from the sounds and voices that had filtered through the open window. "They lost him in the mountains," he wrote before she could speak. "Yes," Rebecca confirmed. "Sheriff Miller tracked him to Bitterroot Pass before losing the trail." Ethan's jaw tightened as he wrote, "He's gone then, for now." "The sheriff has sent warnings throughout the territory," Rebecca said, trying to offer some reassurance. "Whitley won't find it easy to show his face anywhere nearby." Ethan's response was blunt. "Won't need to, has what he wanted. Me off the ranch, unable to work land. Property will fail, go to auction eventually." The stark assessment highlighted an aspect of their situation Rebecca hadn't fully considered, that even without killing Ethan, Whitley might achieve his goal simply by rendering the Blackwood Ranch unviable through Ethan's injury and displacement. "That can't happen," she said firmly. "There must be a way to keep the ranch operating until you're fully recovered." Ethan shook his head, writing, "Takes 2 people minimum. Even when well, struggled alone after Thomas died." Rebecca paced the small room, her mind racing through possibilities. What about hiring help? Surely there are men looking for work in town. Ethan's expression was grimly practical as he wrote, "Requires money. Cattle sales not until spring. Winter coming." The predicament seemed insurmountable when laid out so starkly. A wounded man with limited resources, facing the harsh Montana winter, unable to work his land or protect his livelihood. Exactly as James Whitley had calculated. When he chose this moment to strike, Rebecca sat beside Ethan on the bed, unexpected determination welling up within her. "I won't let him win," she said quietly. "I won't let Whitley destroy what you and your brother built, not after everything that's happened." Ethan studied her face, seeming to weigh her sincerity against the practicalities of their situation. Finally he wrote, "How?" The question hung between them. Simple, direct, and without obvious answer. Rebecca took a deep breath, an idea forming that was either remarkably practical or utterly foolhardy. "I could help," she said, "at the ranch, until you're recovered enough to manage on your own." Ethan's eyebrows rose in astonishment. He wrote rapidly, "You know nothing about ranching." "I'm a quick study," Rebecca countered. "You saw how quickly I adapted to Mrs. Watkins' expectations, and I'm not entirely ignorant of practical matters. I managed my parents' household for years before their deaths." Ethan's expression remained skeptical as he wrote, "Running boarding house not same as ranch work. Hard physical labor. Dangerous at times." "I understand that," Rebecca acknowledged, "but I've seen how this community supports its own. We could ask for guidance where needed. Mr. Patterson or Henry Mason might advise us on critical matters until you're able to demonstrate the necessary skills yourself." She could see Ethan wrestling with the suggestion, practical concerns, battling with the dire reality of his situation. Finally he wrote, "Why would you do this? Barely know me or this place." The question caught Rebecca off guard, not because she hadn't considered it herself, but because articulating her motivations required acknowledging feelings and connections still forming in her own understanding. "Because I came to Montana Territory seeking a new beginning," she said carefully. "The circumstances aren't what I expected, but the opportunity remains. Because helping you defeat Whitley's scheme feels like justice, for the deception practiced on both of us, and because she hesitated, then continued with honest simplicity, because in the short time I've been here, I've come to care what happens to you and to the legacy your brother left behind. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a softening, a recognition of the genuine emotion behind her words. He wrote slowly, "Partnership only, until spring. Then, decide next steps." The practical framing of his acceptance, careful to place boundaries around their arrangement, touched Rebecca with its consideration. He was offering her a way to help without presuming upon deeper feelings that neither of them was ready to name. "Partnership," she agreed, "with the understanding that I return to town if conditions prove too difficult or dangerous." Ethan nodded, and then wrote, "Mrs. Watkins will object." Rebecca smiled slightly. "Leave Mrs. Watkins to me. She's more understanding than she first appears." Her expression grew more serious. "But this arrangement would require certain accommodations to preserve propriety. I could stay in the bunkhouse, perhaps?" Ethan considered this, then wrote, "Bunkhouse sound. Workshop gone. Main house only foundation still. Would need repairs to bunkhouse first. Winter coming." "Then we'll make those repairs a priority," Rebecca said decisively, "as soon as Dr. Henderson declares you fit for limited activity." As if summoned by mention of his name, the doctor appeared, in the doorway, frowning slightly to find his patient sitting up rather than resting. "I see Mr. Blackwood is feeling improved," he observed dryly, "though I don't recall authorizing quite this level of activity yet." "We were discussing important matters regarding the ranch," Rebecca explained. Dr. Henderson snorted. "The ranch will still be there when his concussion is fully resolved." He approached Ethan, examining the healing head wound with practiced efficiency. "Though I must say, you're recovering more quickly than I anticipated. Good constitution and proper care make a difference." He glanced meaningfully at Rebecca, whose attentive nursing had undoubtedly contributed to Ethan's progress. "Another few days of rest, then light activity only for at least 2 weeks. That arm will take longer, 6 weeks minimum, before you should consider any strenuous use." Ethan wrote immediately, "Need to return to ranch sooner." The doctor read the message and shook his head firmly. "Out of the question before week's end, and even then you'll require assistance for basic tasks." He looked between Ethan and Rebecca with sudden perception. "Which, I suspect, is exactly what you two were discussing when I arrived." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "I've offered to help Mr. Blackwood manage the ranch until he's fully recovered." Dr. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "Have you indeed? And do you have any experience with ranch work, Miss Harlow?" "No," she admitted, "but I'm willing to learn, and Mr. Blackwood is an experienced teacher." The doctor studied them both thoughtfully, seeming to assess not just the practical aspects of their plan, but the unspoken dynamics between them. "Well," he said finally, "it's an unorthodox solution, but these are unorthodox circumstances." He turned to Ethan. "If you're determined to return to the ranch before I would medically advise, having assistance is certainly better than attempting to manage alone." Ethan nodded, the relief evident in his posture. The doctor continued, addressing Rebecca, "But I must insist on certain conditions. Mr. Blackwood's injuries are serious, particularly the arm. He must avoid any strenuous activity for at least 3 weeks, preferably longer." "I understand," Rebecca assured him. "His recovery will be my primary concern." As Dr. Henderson departed, leaving them with additional instructions and promises to check on Ethan's progress in a few days, Rebecca felt the weight of the commitment she had just made. She'd arrived in Willow Creek expecting to marry a man she had never met and start a new life on his ranch. Now, through the strangest twist of fate, she found herself preparing to do essentially that, though under dramatically different circumstances, with a different Blackwood brother, and with the shadow of danger still hanging over them both. Ethan seemed to sense her momentary uncertainty, for he wrote, "Still time to reconsider, no obligation." Rebecca shook her head, her resolve strengthening rather than weakening with his consideration. "I've made my decision," she said firmly. "We face this together, as partners." The word seemed to hold new meaning for them both, a compact not based on romantic notions or societal expectations, but on shared purpose and mutual respect forged in adversity. Whatever came next, they would confront it side by side, bound by circumstances neither could have imagined when Rebecca first stepped off the stagecoach in Willow Creek. 5 months had transformed the Blackwood Ranch. Winter's grip had finally loosened its hold on the Montana landscape, the harsh blanket of snow giving way to the first tenuous signs of spring. Patches of green emerged on south-facing slopes, and the creek that bisected the property ran strong with snowmelt from the distant mountains. The bitter cold that had threatened to defeat them in those first desperate weeks after Ethan's injury had gradually retreated, leaving behind a renewed land awakening to possibility. On the ridge overlooking the ranch, Rebecca Harlow paused to catch her breath, leaning on the shovel she'd been using to clear irrigation channels. Her hands, once soft and uncalloused, now bore the marks of honest labor, work that had not only sustained the ranch through the brutal winter months, but had gradually reshaped her understanding of herself and her capabilities. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Willow Creek barely resembled the one who now surveyed the fruits of her determination with quiet pride. From this vantage point, she could see the full extent of what she and Ethan had accomplished since her impulsive decision to become his partner in saving the Blackwood legacy. The bunkhouse, initially repaired just enough to provide her with basic shelter, now stood solid and weather-tight, with a new roof and reinforced walls. A small vegetable garden had been established behind it, already showing the first tender shoots of early plantings. The chicken coop they had constructed during a January thaw now housed a dozen healthy hens, their eggs providing a welcome addition to their limited winter diet. The barn, damaged during Whitley's attack, had been restored to full functionality, providing shelter for their slowly growing herd and the 4 horses they now maintained. Even the blackened ruins of the workshop had been cleared away, with a new, smaller structure rising in its place where Ethan had begun to practice the metalworking skills that had been a childhood interest in Boston, long abandoned during the demands of ranching with his brother. Most significant was the progress on the main house. Where only a stone foundation and chimney had stood among charred timbers, a new structure was taking shape. The framework complete, the roof half-shingled. It was modest compared to what had been lost in the fire, but it represented something profound, a refusal to surrender to circumstances, a determination to rebuild rather than retreat. Rebecca had spent countless hours alongside Ethan, learning to hammer nails, to measure and cut lumber, to envision rooms where only empty space existed. Movement near the corral caught Rebecca's attention. Ethan was working with the new mare they'd purchased from the Pattersons, his movements fluid and confident as he guided the animal through basic commands. His right arm, finally free of its splint after healing properly, still occasionally betrayed stiffness after extended use, but he had regained most of his former strength and dexterity. The transformation in him went beyond the physical. The haunted wariness that had shadowed his eyes in those first encounters had gradually receded, replaced by a quiet contentment she had never expected to witness. Rebecca watched him work, feeling the now familiar warmth that his presence evoked in her. Their partnership had evolved in ways neither could have anticipated when they first struck their practical arrangement. Working side by side through winter storms, sharing meals by lamplight in the cramped bunkhouse, with the door properly left open for propriety's sake, Learning to communicate through intuition as much as Ethan's written words, these shared experiences had forged a bond that transcended conventional relationships. The winter had taught them each other's rhythms, preferences, and unspoken needs. Rebecca had learned to recognize the tension in Ethan's shoulders when memories of Thomas weighed heavily upon him, knew when to offer company and when to provide solitude. Ethan had become attuned to Rebecca's moods as well, surprising her with small comforts when homesickness threatened, fashioning a crude bookshelf for the few volumes she had brought west, carving a wooden hairbrush when hers had broken beyond repair. As if sensing her gaze, Ethan looked up toward the ridge. Even at a distance, she could see his expression brighten as he raised a hand in greeting. Rebecca returned the gesture, then gathered her tools to make her way back down to the ranch yard. The path was muddy from the spring thaw, but she navigated it with the confidence of someone who had traversed it countless times in far more challenging conditions. "The north irrigation channel is clear," she announced as she approached the corral, "though we'll need to shore up that bank before the water rises any higher. The melt is coming faster than last year, according to Mr. Patterson." Ethan nodded, reaching for the slate he still carried in his pocket. Over the months, they had developed an efficient communication rhythm, Rebecca speaking normally, Ethan responding in writing when necessary, though increasingly they found themselves able to converse with minimal words. His expressions and gestures as eloquent as speech to her practiced eye. "Judge Summers arriving tomorrow," he wrote. His handwriting now returned to its former precision since regaining the use of his right hand. "Yes," his letter said he'd be. "Here by midday," Rebecca confirmed, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, leaving a smudge of dirt across her cheek that Ethan gently wiped away with his thumb. "He's bringing the final paperwork from Helena." The mention of Judge Summers brought both anticipation and a tinge of anxiety. His visit represented the culmination of legal proceedings that had occupied much of their attention throughout the winter months, even as they focused on the practical demands of ranch survival. The decisions they had made during those long winter evenings would now be formalized, irrevocably changing the course of both their lives. Ethan led the mare back to her stall, his movements efficient as he removed her tack and provided fresh water. The methodical care he showed with the animals had been one of the first things Rebecca had admired about him. His patience, his gentleness with creatures dependent on him, the wordless communication he had mastered long before his voice had been silenced by trauma. When he returned to where Rebecca waited, his expression had grown more serious. He wrote, "Last chance to reconsider. Decision changes everything." Rebecca shook her head firmly, understanding the depth of concern behind his words. Not doubt about their decision, but a final checking of her certainty before taking such a significant step. "My mind has been made up for some time now, Ethan, unless you've had second thoughts." He held her gaze for a moment, then wrote with deliberate care, "No second thoughts. Just want to be certain. No obligation because of circumstances." This was characteristic of him. The insistence that she maintain freedom of choice, that gratitude or necessity not bind her to decisions she might later regret. It was one of the countless ways he had shown his character over their months together, reinforcing her confidence in the path they had chosen. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Both turned, instantly alert. A legacy of the vigilance they'd maintained since Whitley's attack. The winter had passed without incident, but neither had fully relaxed their guard, too aware of the threat that remained at large. Relief replaced tension when they recognized Sheriff Miller's familiar figure riding toward the ranch. "Afternoon. Miss Harlow, Blackwood," Miller called as he dismounted, looking significantly less burdened than when they'd last seen him 2 weeks prior, the perpetual worry lines in his forehead somewhat diminished. His visits had become less frequent as the immediate danger had seemed to recede, but he had maintained regular checks throughout the winter, true to his word. "Ran into the supply wagon heading this way. Thought I'd ride ahead and bring you the news myself." "What news?" Rebecca asked, a flicker of concern returning despite the sheriff's relaxed demeanor. Miller removed his hat, a smile breaking across his weathered features. "Got a telegram from the federal marshal in Wyoming Territory this morning. They've apprehended James Whitley, or James Warren, as he's been calling himself. Caught him trying to swindle a ranching widow near Cheyenne with the same scheme he used on you, Miss Harlow." The words took a moment to penetrate. After months of looking over their shoulders, of keeping weapons close at hand, of starting at unexpected sounds, the threat that had shaped their existence had suddenly been neutralized. Rebecca felt her knees weaken slightly, and Ethan's hand immediately found the small of her back, steadying her with the instinctive protectiveness that had become second nature between them. "They're certain it's him?" Rebecca pressed. "Hardly daring to believe it. There's no possibility of mistake?" "No doubt whatsoever," Miller assured her, his grin widening. "Had Thomas's pocket watch on him, the one with the Blackwood family crest engraved inside. Must have taken it after the attack." He turned to Ethan. "They're holding him for the Wyoming authorities on the swindling charges, but once I send confirmation, they'll transfer him to Montana Territory to face murder charges. Judge Summers is bringing the extradition papers tomorrow." Ethan's expression transformed with the news, not into simple relief or satisfaction, but something more complex, a releasing of tension so profound it momentarily overwhelmed his customary reserve. For the briefest moment, Rebecca thought she detected moisture in his eyes, quickly blinked away. He reached for his slate. "Will testify. Whatever needed. Want to see justice." "You'll both likely need to give statements eventually," Miller said, "but the evidence against him is substantial. Between your testimony about the attack on you, the possession of Thomas's watch, and the similar pattern with other victims they're discovering, Whitley won't see daylight as a free man again." He clasped Ethan's shoulder firmly. "Your brother can rest easier now, son." "This is wonderful news," Rebecca said, her voice slightly unsteady. "We were beginning to wonder if he'd escaped the territory entirely." "Nearly did," Miller confirmed. "Marshall's telegram said he was preparing to head to California when they caught him. Another day, and he'd have been on a westbound train." He shook his head. "But that's the thing about men like Whitley. They can't stop themselves. The scheme is like a sickness with them. Always one more victim, one more opportunity. After the sheriff departed, promising to return with Judge Summers the following day, Rebecca and Ethan stood in silence, absorbing the implications of this development. 5 months of underlying fear, managed but never absent, suddenly lifted, leaving a strange lightness in its wake. The ranch itself seemed to breathe easier, as if the land could sense the closure of a chapter that had begun with violence and deception. "It's over," Rebecca said softly, the full weight of the words settling around them like a blessing. "Truly over." Ethan took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the winter months. His calloused fingers entwined with hers, conveying a depth of emotion his silence could not express. He led her to the partially rebuilt porch of the main house, their favorite spot to watch the sunset on fair evenings. They sat on the rough-hewn bench Ethan had crafted during the darkest days of winter, when outdoor work had been impossible and indoor projects had kept them sane. The valley spread before them, bathed in late afternoon light. The land, Thomas, Blackwood had chosen with such care that James Whitley had coveted enough to kill for, that Rebecca and Ethan had fought to preserve through a Montana winter against all odds. Its beauty struck Rebecca anew, as it often did in unexpected moments. The sweep of grassland, the dark line of pine forest along the ridges, the distant mountains still crowned with snow. After a while, Ethan wrote, "Not how Thomas would have wanted justice, but it's something." "Yes," Rebecca agreed, understanding that for Ethan no justice could fully compensate for his brother's loss. "And perhaps more important than justice for the past is security for the future. She gazed across the ranch, seeing not just what it was now, but what it could become, with the shadow of threat removed. No more looking over our shoulders, no more wondering if he might return. Ethan nodded, then wrote something that surprised her. "Thank you for staying, for believing. Most would have fled." The simple acknowledgement touched Rebecca deeply. In the months they had worked together, he had shown his gratitude in countless practical ways, but rarely expressed it so directly. "I stayed because this place was worth fighting for," she said quietly, "because what you and Thomas built deserved to survive." She hesitated, then added with characteristic honesty, "And because I found something here I never expected, a genuine home." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the physical structures they had repaired and rebuilt. Home, not just shelter, but belonging, connection, purpose. The discovery that sometimes life's greatest gifts arrive disguised as its cruelest disappointments. Ethan studied her face, his eyes reflecting emotions too complex for his slate to capture. Finally, he wrote, "Tomorrow changes everything." Rebecca knew he referred to Judge Summers' visit and the legal matters that would be settled, the formal resolution to arrangements they had discussed carefully over many winter evenings, their breath visible in the cold air of the bunkhouse. As they planned for a future neither had imagined when Rebecca first arrived in Willow Creek. "It formalizes what's already true," she corrected gently. "It doesn't change how we feel or what we've built together." Ethan set aside his slate and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that caught the afternoon light. He held it out to her, a ring fashioned from a silver dollar, meticulously worked to create a band with a simple, elegant design. Tiny mountain ranges had been etched into the surface, circling the band like the horizons that surrounded their ranch. Rebecca's breath caught. She had known this moment was coming, had expected it since they had made their decision weeks ago, but the physical symbol in Ethan's palm still affected her profoundly. The craftsmanship represented countless hours of secret work in the evenings after she had retired to the bunkhouse, his fingers learning a new skill to create this token of their commitment. "You made this," she said softly, recognizing the style from the other small items he had created during the winter when they had discovered his talent for metalwork extended beyond practical ranch repairs. Ethan nodded, his expression holding a question as he offered it to her. Despite all they had decided, all they had planned, this moment of offering remained vulnerable, a man whose voice had been stolen by trauma, asking the most important question of his life through a silver circle formed by his own hands. Rebecca extended her left hand without hesitation, allowing him to slide the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. Ethan had surreptitiously measured while holding her hand during their evening conversations, though she had pretended not to notice his careful attention to the size of her fingers. "It's beautiful," she whispered, blinking back unexpected tears. "The mountains, they're us, aren't they? This place, what we've built here." He took up his slate again, writing words that needed to be expressed explicitly, even between two people who had learned to communicate in silence. Not just partnership anymore. "If you still want this," Rebecca smiled through her tears. "I want this, you, this ranch, the life we're building. I have for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself." Ethan's responding smile transformed his features, erasing the final traces of the haunted, silent man she had first encountered amid the ruins of his brother's ranch. He wrote one more line. "Thomas would have approved of you, of us." "I believe he would," Rebecca agreed, touching the ring that now symbolized a future neither of them had imagined when fate and deception first brought them together. Though Not as much as he would approve of what you've accomplished here. The ranch isn't just surviving, Ethan. It's thriving because of your determination, your refusal to be defeated. Ethan shook his head slightly, then wrote, "Because of us. Couldn't have done it alone." He paused, then added, "Partnership saved everything. You saved everything." The truth of this simple statement encompassed their entire journey, from strangers united by deception to partners in survival to something deeper and more profound. Neither could have succeeded alone. Together, they had not merely endured, but flourished. The following day brought Judge Summers as promised, his carriage arriving precisely at noon. He greeted them warmly, his eyes moving appreciatively over the visible improvements throughout the ranch since his last visit in early winter. "Thomas would be proud," he said, echoing Rebecca's words from the previous evening. "This place was his dream, but you've made it something even beyond what he envisioned." He turned to Rebecca with genuine admiration. "And you, Miss Harlow, I scarcely recognize the uncertain young woman who arrived on that stagecoach last autumn. Montana Territory agrees with you." "It does," Rebecca acknowledged, conscious of the silver ring on her finger that caught the judge's observant eye. "Though it took some adjustment on both our parts." They settled in the bunkhouse, where Judge Summers spread official documents across the table that had witnessed so many of their winter meals and conversations. "I've brought everything as requested," he said. "The deed transfer documents for the Blackwood Ranch, the partnership agreement, and," he extracted a final document with particular care, "the marriage license, to be completed and signed today if that remains your intention." Rebecca and Ethan exchanged glances, a private communication passing between them. Then Ethan wrote firmly, "It does." As they proceeded through the formalities, Rebecca reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Montana Territory as a mail-order bride, expecting to marry Thomas Blackwood and live in his established home. Instead, she had found the courage to rebuild from ashes, both literally and figuratively, alongside a man whose silence had initially seemed an insurmountable barrier, but had ultimately taught her the profound difference between words and communication. When the final document was signed, Judge Summers closed his portfolio with satisfaction. "Well, that's settled. The Blackwood Ranch is now legally owned in partnership by Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Blackwood." He smiled at them both. "Though I confess, this is the first wedding I've officiated where the groom didn't speak his vows aloud." Ethan raised an eyebrow, then wrote something that made the judge laugh aloud. Actions speak louder anyway. Later, after Judge Summers had departed with promises to return for a proper celebration once the main house was completed, Rebecca and Ethan stood together on the rise overlooking their property. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land that was now legally as well as emotionally theirs to share. "Mrs. Blackwood," Rebecca said, testing the sound of her new name, "I never did get to be a Blackwood bride the way I expected. Did I?" Ethan's eyes crinkled with amusement as he wrote, "Better than expected." Rebecca looked across the ranch, at the rebuilding house, the thriving livestock, the land beginning to awaken from winter's dormancy, and then at the man beside her, whose silent strength had become the foundation of her new life. "Infinitely better," she confirmed softly, "because it's real, built with our own hands, not on false promises or convenient arrangements." Ethan slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her closer as they surveyed their domain. Behind them lay the past, Thomas's death, Whitley's deception, the long struggle against elements and circumstance. Before them stretched a future they had forged together. Its challenges certainly not over, but now faced with the confidence born of shared triumph over adversity. The silent man and the mail-order bride, who never met her intended groom, had found something neither had been seeking, not just survival or security, but a genuine partnership built on the strongest foundation of all, truth discovered in silence, strength revealed in vulnerability, and love born from the ashes of deception. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the Montana sky in shades of amber and gold, they turned together toward the bunkhouse, their temporary home, until the new house was complete. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more steps in their continuing journey. But tonight belonged to celebration, to the quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come and the path they would continue to walk side by side. The mail-order bride had indeed found her Montana home, not in the way she had imagined, but in a reality far richer and more meaningful than any promise penned in a stranger's letters could have provided. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.